know that feeling when a story gets inside you before you even realize it's happening? That is what today is. My name is Ren. I write stories about people who find each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow, against everything, make it work. And this one is my favorite kind, a woman on a run. A man who says very little but means everything he says. One frozen night. One small decision that changes both of their lives completely. There's warmth in the story. There's tension. There's a twist at the end that I genuinely cannot wait for you to reach. Stay with me all the way through. I promise you it is worth it. And if you are new here, welcome. Hit subscribe because I have so many more of these waiting for you. Now, let's begin. The first frost of the season came without warning that year. It swept down from the mountain ridge just after midnight, wrapping the village of Ironmark in a silence so total that even the hounds stopped barking. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission, the kind that finds every crack in every wall and reminds you, quietly, that the world does not care whether you survive it. Most of the village had gone to sleep by then. The candle makers, the weavers, the widow who sold bread by the river road every morning without fail. They were all behind locked doors, pressed under furs, listening to the wind scrape against their shuttered windows. But the forge at the edge of Ironmark never slept. It stood apart from the rest of the village, the way a man stands apart who has learned that silence is easier than explanation. Set into the base of a granite slope, its stone chimney pushing smoke up into the frozen sky in a column that glowed orange against the black. A heartbeat of fire in the dead of winter. The forge of Calum Voss. No one in Ironmark called him by his first name. They called him the Mountain. They called him the Big One. The children who were too young to know better called him a giant, and they were not entirely wrong. Calum stood 2 heads taller than any man in the valley, his shoulders wide enough that doorways required him to turn sideways before entering. Black hair cut short and rough, like he'd done it himself with a knife, which he had. Hands that looked like they had been carved from the same iron he worked. A jaw that looked like it had met something harder than itself, at least. One had come out the winner. He had been awake since before the frost came. He was always awake. Inside the forge that night, the sound of iron meeting iron rang out in steady, measured beats. Calum's hammer rose and fell against the glowing blade on his anvil. Each strike, precise. Each pause considered. Sweat ran down the lines of his bare torso despite the cold that pressed in at the gaps in the stone walls. The fire in the bellows behind him, threw his shadow long across the workshop floor, enormous and flickering, like something alive. He did not hear the door open. He heard almost everything. That was the thing people in Ironmark did not fully understand about Calum Voss. Behind the silence he kept in the distance he preferred, he was constantly listening. The way a wolf listens, the way something raised in the wilderness learns to track the sound of snow shifting before it falls. But the wind had picked up, and the hammer was loud, and whoever opened the back door of his forge that night knew exactly how to move through the world without making a sound. She came in like the cold itself, silent, low, pressing herself against the far wall between a rack of finished blades and a stack of coke coal, folding down into the darkest corner of the forge with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a long time making themselves invisible. A wool cloak, dark and travel-stained, pulled tight around a frame, too slight for the weather outside. Her breath came in shallow pulls, controlled the way you breathe when you are trying very hard not to be heard. Callum set the hammer down. He did not turn around. He reached for the rag on the corner of the anvil and wiped his hands slowly, the way a man does when he is thinking. The fire popped once. The wind moved through the gap under the door, and then the only sound in the forge was breathing. 2 sets of it. He turned. The woman in the corner had gone completely still, the way a deer goes still when it realizes it has been seen. Her hood had fallen back during whatever scramble had brought her to the floor, and in the orange light of the forge fire, her hair was extraordinary. Long and straight, and the white of new snow, of birch bark, of the frost that had just arrived outside. It pooled over her shoulders and across the stone floor where she had settled, almost luminous against the dark cloak. Her skin was the same shade, the color of winter moonlight. Her eyes, wide and watching him, were pale silver, like ice over deep water. She was beautiful in the way that cold things are beautiful. Still, severe, dangerous to touch without knowing why. She did not speak. He did not move. For a long moment, the two of them remained exactly as they were, and the forge fire crackled between them like it was deciding something. Then, Caleb said without raising his voice, "You picked a strange night to go exploring." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing. "You've been running," he said. Not a question. He could see it in the mud caked along the hem of her cloak, in the way she was holding her left arm slightly away from her body, in the raw state of her knuckles. He could see it in the way she was looking at him, calculating the distance between herself and the door she had come through. Whatever you're running from, it came close enough that you needed to get off the road. She lifted her chin. "I didn't come here for conversation." "No," he agreed. "You came here for heat." Something shifted in her expression, not quite embarrassment, something more careful than that. "The forge is mine," he said. "The heat is mine. But the cold is everyone's tonight, and I'm not going to make you go back into it." He turned back to the anvil, picked up the hammer. "Stay in the corner if you want. I have work to finish." She stared at the back of him for a long moment, at the breadth of his shoulders, at the way the firelight moved over the muscled terrain of his back, at the absolute, unhurried certainty with which he had turned away from her, as if she had already been decided upon. Then, slowly, she let herself breathe again. She did not move from the corner, but she let the tension leave her shoulders, degree by degree, as the heat of the forge reached her through the dark wool of her cloak. She watched him work, the rhythm of the hammer, the way he handled the iron, turning the blade on the anvil with tongs that looked delicate in hands, that at large. He worked the way he breathed, like someone who had long since stopped performing for anyone. Her name was Sarah. She did not tell him that. She had been on the road for 11 days. She did not tell him that either. What she had been running from was the kind of thing that does not fit neatly into explanations, especially not to strangers in forges at midnight. What she carried in the leather satchel pressed against her ribs was the kind of thing that made strangers dangerous. She had learned over 11 days and before them that the first rule of staying alive was to tell no one anything they could use. She was very good at that rule. She was less good, it turned out, at staying awake. The warmth crept through her, slowly, filling the cold places in her chest, in her hands, in the bones of her feet that had been numb since sundown. Her eyelids grew heavy. She fought it for a while, watching Kylem's shadow move against the far wall, watching the door, listening to the wind. But the forge was warm, and the man's back was turned and the hammer was steady and rhythmic, and her body had been running for 11 days. She was asleep before the hour turned. Caleb finished the blade just after the third bell. He set it in the cooling rack, banked the fire down to a steady hold, and turned around. She had folded herself into the corner like something that had learned to take up as little space as possible. The dark cloak had shifted, and in the banked light, he could see more of her face, the sharp line of her jaw, the shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with firelight, the slight parting of her mouth as she breathed, deep and quiet, the sleep of someone who had pushed far past the edge of themselves and finally stopped. Her white hair spilled across the stone floor like frost creeping over pavement. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he crossed to the storage cabinet along the back wall, pulled out the heavy wool blanket he kept there for nights when the work ran long and the road home felt longer. He crossed back to her corner, crouched down, careful to keep his footsteps quiet, and settled the blanket over her without waking her. Up close, the detail of her was different than from across the forge. The faint constellation of pale freckles across the bridge of her nose. The way her lashes, almost white, lay against her cheek. The bruise along her jaw that she had been careful to keep turned toward the wall. Someone had hit her, his jaw set. He straightened and went to the chair by the banked fire and sat down and watched the door. When she woke, it was gray outside and still cold, and he was where he had been. The chair by the fire, his arms crossed, his eyes open and already on her. She went rigid immediately, then caught herself, looked down at the blanket that had not been there when she fell asleep, looked back up at him. "You didn't leave," she said. "It's my forge." "You could have woken me." "Could have," he agreed. She pushed herself upright, folding the blanket with a precision that looked habitual, the way soldiers fold things. Set it on the coal stack beside her, reached for her satchel and checked the strap, the latch, the weight of it. The movement was so automatic, she probably didn't know she was doing it. He noticed. "There's porridge on the side grate," he said, "and water in the black pot. It's been hot since the fourth bell." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Neither of them said anything about the night, or the blanket, or the bruise on her jaw. "Why?" she finally said. He considered the question the way he considered iron, turning it, checking its weight, deciding where to put the hammer. "Because you looked like you needed it," he said. "And because whatever you're running from hasn't shown up at my door yet. So, you're still a guest. And when it does show up," the fire popped in the banked coals, "then we'll see," he said. It was not a threat. It was not a promise. It was the truth, stated plainly. The way he stated everything. She looked at him for a long time with those silver eyes, reading him. The way she had learned to read people quickly, out of necessity, looking for the angle, the price, the thing underneath the kindness that would eventually reveal itself to be something else. She found nothing, or rather, she found something she did not have a word for yet. She got up. She went to the side grate. She ate the porridge standing up, facing the wall, which he did not comment on. When she turned back around, he had already gone to the anvil, had already lit the bellows, was already somewhere else inside his own head, and the hammer had found its rhythm, and the forge was awake again, and the space it created was the closest thing she had felt to safe in 11 days. She sat back down in her corner. She told herself it was only for the morning. She told herself it was only for the morning. Then the morning became noon, and noon became the afternoon light, cutting long and amber through the gap in the forge stones. And somewhere in the middle of it, Kaloum set a second cup of water near the corner without looking at her, and she drank it without thanking him. And neither of them said a word about the fact that she was still there. By the second day, she had moved from the corner, not far, just to the low bench along the side wall where he kept his sharpening stones and his smaller tools. She sat there with her satchel between her feet and watched him work, and he worked. And the silence between them was the particular kind of silence that is not empty, but full. The kind that has weight and warmth and its own slow language. On the third morning, he said, without turning from the anvil, "You're going to develop a crick in your neck watching from that angle." She said, "I'm fine." He said, "You could help instead of watching." She looked at the forge, at the fire, at the rack of iron rods waiting to be worked. She had never been inside a working forge before in her life. "I don't know how to do anything useful in here." He finally turned. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way he had, unhurried and direct, like he was reading something written in small letters. "You have steady hands," he said. "That's most of it." She looked down at her hands. They were, in fact, very still. He pulled a short iron rod from the rack and handed it to her along with the long tongs he used for holding work near the fire. He showed her where to grip, where to stand, at the angle to hold the rod in the coals, and how long to leave it before the color told you it was ready. He stood behind her shoulder as he explained it, close enough that the heat of the forge was indistinguishable from the heat of him, and her white hair drifted back against his chest in the updraft from the bellows, and he did not step away. "Now," he said. His voice was low near her ear, lower than it was when he spoke across the room. "Pull it out, slow." She pulled the rod from the coals. The tip glowed a brilliant orange red in the dim forge light, molten and alive. "Now hold it over the anvil." She moved it. Her hands were steady. The rod was heavy, but she did not show that. He reached around her and guided her grip on the tongs with one large hand, adjusting the angle by a fraction, and where his fingers closed over hers, the contact was brief and deliberate, and neither of them remarked on it. He stepped back, picked up a small hammer, brought it down on the glowing iron once, twice, reshaping the tip into a clean point, and with each strike, the vibration ran back through the tongs and up her arms, and she felt it in her teeth, in her sternum, like standing next to a bell when it rings. "There," he said. "You didn't drop it." I told you I had steady hands. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, like a door left slightly open. That evening she told him her name, just her first name, and only that, and he took it without asking for more, which was the thing that made her give it. "Sarah," he said, once, like he was noting its weight. "Calum," she said back. "Most people call me the mountain." "I'm not most people." He looked at her across the fire. "No," he said, "you're not." She slept on the bench that night instead of the corner, and he did not comment on that either. On the 5th day, she laughed for the first time at something he said about the ironmonger who delivered his ore and the ironmonger's donkey and the ongoing philosophical disagreement between the two of them about who was more stubborn. It was a low laugh, surprised out of her, quickly contained, but it changed the light in the room in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He watched it happen and then looked back at his work, and the corner of his mouth did what it had been doing more frequently, that almost smile that she had started cataloging without realizing it. She caught herself doing it one evening and stopped, set her hands flat on her knees, looked at the opposite wall. She was not here to catalog anything about him. She was here because the road was dangerous and the forge was warm and she had not yet figured out the next step. That was all. That was the entire extent of it. She believed that for approximately another hour. On the 6th night, the temperature dropped again, harder than the first frost, and the wind drove through the gap under the back door in a way that no amount of banking the fire could entirely overcome. Calum had gone to push a rolled cloth against the gap and had come back to find her standing close to the forge, arms folded against herself, her breath visible even in the interior warmth of the workshop. He crossed to where she stood. He did not ask. He simply settled his hands on her upper arms, turned her slightly so the fire was at her back instead of her side, and left his hands there for a moment, longer than the movement required. His palms were warm through the thin fabric of her shirt. She'd taken her cloak off 3 days ago and had not put it back on. "Better?" he said. She could feel the heat of the fire at her back and the heat of him at her front, and the distance between them was the width of a long breath, in or out, hers or his. "Yes," she said, quietly. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. His black hair had fallen across his forehead from the work of the evening, and his dark eyes in the firelight were the color of deep iron before it glows, the color of something that holds heat long after the source is gone. "Sarah," he said, the way he'd said it the first time, but different, lower, like something that had been waiting. She closed the distance between them. The forge fire threw their shadows long against the stone wall, tangled together. Two shapes becoming one shape in the orange dark. The iron cooling in the rack ticked softly. The wind pressed against the walls and found no way in. What happened between them in the warmth of that forge on the 6th night of her staying was the kind of thing that does not belong to words. The kind of thing that lives only in the sensation of two people who have been orbiting each other, finally stopping. The fire was very bright, and then it was only embers, and the night was long and quiet and entirely theirs. She did not leave in the morning. He did not pretend to be surprised. She woke to the sound of him at the bellows, already working, and she lay still for a moment in the warmth he'd left behind and listened to the rhythm of the forge coming alive, and something inside her that had been clenched for 11 days, for longer than that, for years, unclenched by a single degree, and she let it. They did not speak about the night before in the way that people sometimes feel they must. They spoke about iron, about the particular qualities of the ore from the eastern ridge versus the southern valley, about the sword commission he was 3 days from finishing. She handed him tools when he reached for them without being asked, and the second time it happened, he paused and looked at her, with something in his face she didn't have a name for yet. She was starting to think she wanted to find one. It was the 9th morning when they came. She heard the horses first, 3 sets of hooves on the road from the village, moving at a deliberate pace. Not the pace of merchants or travelers or farmers bringing metal to be worked. She was on her feet before she had fully registered why, her satchel already in her hands, her body moving toward the back of the forge. Caleb stepped in front of her, not a dramatic step, not a theatrical one. He simply moved from where he had been to where she was going, and the sheer fact of him in that space stopped her. "Go to the back room," he said. His voice had not changed. Same register, same unhurried quality, but something underneath it had shifted, the way iron shifts when the temperature changes. Behind the storage cabinet, there's a space in the wall. It looks like stone. She looked up at him. "Caleb, Sarah." He said it the way he said everything, like a hammer strike that lands exactly where it was aimed. "Go," she went. The back room was dim and smelled of raw metal and old smoke. She found the space he meant, a narrow gap behind the cabinet where the original wall met an older foundation, wide enough for a person of her size if they stood sideways and didn't breathe too large. She pressed herself in, pulled the cabinet edge back to where it had been, and listened. She heard the forge door open, felt the cold roll in from outside. She heard a voice she recognized, clipped and male and carrying the particular arrogance of men who are paid to find things and have never once been told they couldn't. "Blacksmith," the voice said. "We're looking for a woman. White hair, white skin. She'd have come through in the last week or 10 days. We have reason to believe she came this way from the eastern road." A pause. Then Caleb's voice, flat and steady as the anvil he stood beside. "No one like that has come through here." "You're certain?" "I work alone. I sleep alone. I would notice a woman." Another pause. She could hear boots on the forge floor, moving slowly. She made herself breathe through her nose. Slow, quiet. "She's carrying something," the voice said. "Something that belongs to people who are very much not accustomed to being denied. If you've seen her and you're choosing not to say, that's a position you would regret." Silence from Caleb. The long, absolute silence of a man who has heard the word regret used as a threat before and found it the least convincing thing in the world. "I said she hasn't been here," he said. "Now I've got work to finish and you're letting in the cold." A very long pause. "If she turns up," the voice said, "she won't." The boots moved back toward the door. The cold pulled out of the room like a held breath releasing. The door closed. Sarah did not move for a long time after the hooves faded. When she came out of the back room, Caleb was at the anvil. He did not turn around. "They'll be back," he said. "I know. Then you need to tell me what's in the satchel." She stood in the middle of the forge floor and looked at his back, at the certainty of his shoulders, at the man who had lied to 3 armed hunters without hesitating, without asking her first, and she made a decision. She set the satchel on the workbench, opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with wax cord, was a document. She unwound the cord, unfolded the cloth, held it out. He turned, crossed to the bench, looked down at what she was holding. It was a royal deed of lineage, written in the formal script of the High Court of the 3 Rivers Province, stamped in 3 places with seals that even a blacksmith in a village on the edge of nowhere recognized as the kind that moved armies when invoked. And at the top, in letters that left no room for misreading, was a name. Her name. Her full name. Sarah Vane, named heir of the Vane Protectorate by blood right and witnessed covenant, whose claim to the northern estate and its annexed territories had been suppressed for 19 years by the current administrator. Her mother's younger brother, a man who had been sending hunters to find her for the better part of 2 years. Caleb looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You're not a runaway," he said. "I'm a very specific kind of runaway," she said. "You're an heir. A very cold, very tired heir who needed somewhere to be safe for longer than a night." She held his gaze. "You didn't ask me what was in the satchel before you lied to them for me." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The forge fire moved behind him. He reached out and gently, deliberately, refolded the document and set it back in the oilcloth and tied the cord. Pushed the satchel back toward her hands. "Because," he said, "you looked like someone worth lying for before I knew any of the rest of it." She looked at him for a long time, at the man who was too large for ordinary doors, who left blankets on cold women without waking them, who made porridge before dawn and said her name like it cost him something to keep it inside. "I have to go to the capital," she said, "to file the claim in person. It's the only way to make them stop sending people." "I know. It's a 12-day journey." "I know." She tilted her head slightly. The firelight moved in her silver eyes. "The man who makes that journey with me would be in considerable danger for most of it." He picked up his hammer. "When do we leave?" he said. She had spent 2 years running. She had spent 11 days finding the courage to stop. She had spent 9 days in a forge at the edge of a village, learning that safety was not a place, but a person, and that warmth was not only fire. She smiled, for the first time fully, without catching it and pulling it back. It changed her face the way dawn changes a winter morning, sudden and complete, and worth every hour of cold that came before it. "Tomorrow," she said, "after you finish the sword commission." He almost smiled back. "Obviously." Outside, the frost on the ground was already beginning to soften in the thin morning sun. The first suggestion of a thaw. The long winter was not over, but the worst of it had passed. And in the forge at the edge of Ironmark, the fire burned steady and bright, tended by hands that had found each other in the dark and did not intend to let go. She had been running toward something without knowing it. He had been waiting without knowing what for. The first frost had brought her to his door, and everything that came after was the rest of their lives.